followed by a discussion. By which time the audience will be sufficiently exhausted and want to be wanting to go home.
I don't think so. You are all here, so they're all excited to hear you.
Should we begin? Whenever you're ready, sir. I'm happy to start whenever. So
yeah. Let us get a signal from Mahmood.
I think we can start. We can start. Yeah.
We can start. Okay. Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to this platform of iShore. For those who are not familiar with iShore, it stands for Institute for Social Sciences, Humanities and Oceanic Research, which is primarily a network of scholars from Kerala working all over India and beyond the country, and with a shared interest in Kerala's broader histories, cultures in the oceanic world, with a transdisciplinary orientation. The Institute is a registered society now. It aims to promote advanced studies and research in humanities and social sciences, and also aim to provide a platform for researchers who are interested in studying the region of Kerala in the connected world. And today's discussion is part of a new series that iShore launched a couple of months back called Talking Texts. The series is featuring discussions on important and exciting books on Kerala, published in recent times. And we hope that the series would allow authors to talk about their monographs and engage in conversation with reputed scholars and discussants, as well as with interested scholars and researchers and students. And this is fourth in the series. We had discussions on books by Dr. Ruchi Chaturvedi, Dr. K.N. Sunandan, Dr. Darshana Sridhar Mini earlier in this series. And today we are going to have a discussion on this book titled as Social Spaces and the Public Sphere, a Spatial History of Modernity in Kerala, published by Routledge in 2023 by Dr. S. Harikrishnan. I understand that this book comes out of his doctoral thesis submitted to the Dublin City University in 2020. What is at the center of this book is the making of modernity in Kerala through considered struggles for access to public spaces, institutional as well as non-institutional spaces, which of course played a crucial role in shaping the political culture of the region and contesting dominant hegemonies of caste, class, gender, religion, and for that reason, even capital, which is, of course, an ongoing struggle, assuming newer forms and newer targets. Dr. Harikrishnan is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Law and Government at the Dublin City University, where, as I already said, he has completed his PhD. He is also a member of the Ireland-India Institute. His areas of expertise are Lefebvrean studies, spatiality and modernity, and he has also previously held research positions at the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, at Johannesburg, King's India Institute in London, and Democratic and Progress Institute in London. Also, he's, as you might be knowing, he's also the co-editor of this publication called Allah. And we have two distinguished discussants today joining us discussing the book, who has closely read the book and sharing their reflections on the book. Professor Dilip Menon is well known to all of us. He's a historian and is currently a professor of history and international relations at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He is the founder director of the Center of Indian Studies in Africa over there. And his work, he works on the social and intellectual history of modern India and has engaged with diverse issues like caste, inequality, socialism, etc., which has featured in some of his earlier publications, like the book Caste, Nationalism and Communism in South India, published by Cambridge University Press, and also Blindness of Insight, essays on caste in modern India. He has also edited books, for instance, The Multiple Histories of Capitalism towards a global history of capitalism. And recently he is venturing into certain new directions in his research, which includes oceanic histories, theory from the global south, and of course, the planetary histories. And some of his recent publications basically reflect this important change, which is happening there. Dr. Carmel Christie is the second discussant today. She is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Human Rights Institute, the University of Connecticut. Her research is at the crossroads of gender studies, media studies, and urban studies. And many of us might be aware of a book which was published in 2017, titled Sexuality and Public Culture in India, Reading the Visible, which basically discussed the hypervisibility of women's sexuality, particularly in the decade of 1990s in the Indian media through the lens of caste. She's currently working on this second monograph, which is about the urban space making in the post-colonial India, with special reference to the question of inequality, environment, protest movements, and spatial justice. Dr. Christie held several visiting fellowships, which includes the ones at Glasgow, Paris, Leiden, London, and the University of California, Santa Cruz. She also teaches at the University of Delhi. So very happy to have all of you here. And the format of today's session would be something like this. Dr. Harikrishnan will speak for the first 20-25 minutes. And then each of the discussants can actually take 15 minutes each, reflecting on the book. And then we will open up for a general discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Harikrishnan.
Thank you very much. I'm going to quickly try and share my screen. Okay, is that visible? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here, and it's so nice to see a lot of familiar and new faces engaging here. I'd like to thank iShore for sort of inviting me to present my book, and both to Dilip and Carmel for taking the time to engage with it at length as well. Like Dilip was saying, we've discussed the book in different formats earlier, but it's the first time we've actually gotten to be on a panel to talk about it. So I'm looking forward to insights from all of you. What I've been asked to do is sort of present the main arguments in my book in about 20 minutes, which is an awfully short time period. But what I will try and do though is give a brief background and context of how I started working on this monograph and what brought me to these questions and why I thought these questions were important to look at. Following which I will then look at some of the theoretical and empirical considerations that led me to pick a framework, specifically the idea of spatial history and what I mean by it and why I thought it was important to look at the modernity in Kerala from that lens. So I'll speak a little bit about that. I will then make very briefly the main arguments that I'm trying to make in the book. Of course, I'll be happy to go back into details of it, read more examples from the book as and when time, with time if it permits. But for the presentation, what I'll do is very briefly go over the summary of the main arguments that I make in the book. And I will end with sort of a couple of interesting thoughts on where I hope to take that work in the future. And this, I think, is an open, again, it's a work on that's ongoing. And I'm very curious to also hear inputs on these sort of trajectories and what the possibilities might be of that. To sort of begin with, I started working on this project in 2015. And for those, I see most people might know the context, but I'll just briefly summarize the context for those who may not be aware of the background of this area. So 2015 was a year after the BJP wins the first election in India at the national level. And although the political party itself didn't perform very well in the elections in Kerala, there were very clear indications that there was a change in the political culture as such that was happening even in a place like Kerala, which for many decades had been written about, at least in academic terms, as if it was some sort of an exception, as if we speak about this Kerala model, the bubble of this liberalism and this, secularism and inclusion and all of these ideas. And increasingly over the last 10 years, we had started seeing indications that had started to shape, to sort of that shook people and made them wonder about what was happening to this sort of progressive, quote unquote, secular public sphere that exists in Kerala. The couple of pictures here on the one on the left, you might remember, is a picture from the Sabrimala agitation, where women who had protested against the court verdict at the time that had asked Sabrimala to open up the temple to everyone, had started to protest against that court verdict. And one of the marked points about this was that a lot of the protests that happened were led by women who were women of faith, and they were pious, and they were, they believed in the temple, and they had what came to be called a ready to wait campaign, where they were saying we're happy to wait. And a lot of these demonstrations were happening in public spaces like the streets and the four squares and the likes. But for people from Kerala, those kind of public versions of protests or occupation of public spaces wasn't very stark, because that is something that we've seen for many, many decades now. There were other instances, like the picture that I have on the right here is from a case that also happened in 2008, and some of you might remember this. This was the controversy around a caste wall that comes up around Bajanamadam Devi temple. This is a temple outside of Ernakulam, where there was a piece of land that was used by people belonging to all communities living in the neighborhood, and suddenly the temple that was adjacent to it had decided to build a wall around it. Now, this privatization of a former public space meant that it was cutting off access to that space for a lot of people who had been using that land for decades. There were protests against it. There was especially led by the immediate people living in the area who belonged to Dalit or caste oppressed communities, who tore down the wall, and there was an agitation, and then it went to court, and the court case is still sort of pending, and it has been there. There were other instances like the gruesome murder of Kevin that we all might remember. There was the case of Madhu, who was the Adivasi tribal youth who was lynched for stealing some groceries because he was hungry. So increasingly, there was a visible unease with these sort of incidents, where people who had claimed this sort of exceptionalism of some form had started to think about what is changing. Why is it that we are seeing these? Is this a sort of a new change that's happening in the public sphere, where politics is shaping up in a specific form and way? Or is it a response in some sense to some other intangible changes or forms of power relations that were changing on a larger scale, be it at the national level politics or the international level? Now, these were some interesting questions with which I started looking at this question. And as I'm trained in political science, and as most students of political science, I went starting to look at some of these answers by looking at the Habermas's conception of the public sphere. Where for those who may not be aware of his work, Habermas was looking at sort of Western Europe in the early modern era to argue how the idea of a public opinion or a public sphere was shaping in elite spaces like the coffee shops, the salons in France, the literary societies in Germany, and how it was the intelligentsia in these spaces that were shaping up a certain form of democracy or democratic politics that was inclusive of the people who used these spaces. Now, the Habermas's argument is that as democracies grow, these spaces become more and more democratic, both in quantity and quality. The quality of engagement gets better. They become democratic, and more people are allowed to come in and use these spaces, which means public opinion is something that we can, gauge from the discussions that happen here. The problem is that increasingly, theoretically, there were critiques of the Habermasian notion of the public sphere, especially the universal assumptions that Habermas makes, that this is the trajectory that the public sphere will follow, no matter where in the world you look at them. There were gender scholars, people like Nancy Fraser, other people who are arguing that there are counter publics and that people aren't always a part of these political discussions, and certain groups have always remained outside of these. And we can't look at the public sphere if we don't look at the voices that are coming from these places. The other critique has been the despatialized nature. And this is something that also stood out for me when I first went for my pilot visit to Kerala, because when you start speaking with the people, the sense that you get of the nature of public spaces in Kerala, of the public sphere in Kerala, don't really relate with the elite sort of version of them that Habermas speaks about in the early modern stages. If anything, a lot of these spaces from their origin tend to be a bit more democratic in Kerala in some sense, while other ways there were other forms of invisibilities that existed in these spaces that Habermas doesn't account for. So this made it clear then that there was a need for a revisit of the public sphere as we understand it from a very spatial lens, right? This is because the discursive element of the public sphere that Habermas speaks about, there's been a lot of work done on this already. People have looked at the literary public sphere, for example, in Kerala, and what it contributes. Dilip's work as well as from early 20th century, looking at the cosmopolitan nature of literature that emerges during this period, for example. People have looked at, others have looked at the party institutions and what that has done to the public sphere. In Kerala, people like Jeffrey have written and others have written about the media, the little magazines, all of which proliferated in Kerala in the 20th century and how they shaped the public sphere. For me, it felt like looking at a very spatial history where we accept and understand that these very physical, tangible spaces are also where the public sphere is performed. Looking at a spatial history then became an interesting question for me for two reasons. One is because it also lets us look at questions of caste and gender, which don't always make themselves evident in other forms of public sphere or are harder to measure in some sense. The second reason is looking at the importance of praxis. And this is something that critics of Habermas within India have also written about. People like Pandian have written already in the 90s about how when we look at a colonial public that emerges in India, you can't look at it if you only look at the elites or the people who were, the upper castes who were part of these public spheres, because large portions of the colonial public were left outside of it. And unless we look at the lived experiences of these people, we can only get to a very limited understanding of the public sphere in that context. And this is the other argument that comes up. So it became very clear that it is useful, that a useful way to begin this analysis would be to look at what was happening to colonial publics that were emerging in this period in different parts. I did this by looking at existing works, independent works that was already done on the idea of the public culture, the civic culture, or the political sphere in the west, north, and south of India. The works of people like Haynes, Bailey, Bate, and Sandria Freitag, all of who were looking at the emergence of a modern public sphere during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in different parts of colonial India. And I won't go into the details of what their arguments are, but one thing that stood out for me from all of these is that without making it very obvious, they were all alluding to a very important transformation that happens spatially in these cases. So, for example, in Tamil Nadu, where Bate argues that there was the emergence of a progressive sort of vibrant public culture, two things happen. One is that there is a vernacularization of the speeches and the politics. It happened. The leaders move away from speaking in English into vernacularizing it and speaking in Tamil and Telugu, which were the language that people in the area spoke. The other thing that also happens is that these meetings and these discussions move away from private clubs onto spaces like the beach. Now, that automatically makes them in some sense more accessible because more people are able to access these spaces. So what becomes really evident is that even when we were to look at the emergence of the early public sphere in colonial India, a useful way to do that would be to look at how spaces changed, because spaces are quite centric to the evolution of these public spaces in the early modern period. This is what then led me to the theoretical framework that I have, and I promise this is the last theory slide that I have. But I found the work of the French humanist Marxist Henri Lefebvre a lot more useful. Lefebvre is a very known figure for people who work in geography or cultural studies, less so in political science, which is the background that I come from. But for me, it opened up an alternative way of looking at the public sphere by analyzing the spaces that exist within it. So the broad argument that Lefebvre makes is that when we study a space, it is not just an avenue for economic exchange. It is also a space for much more than that. So he distinguishes between how a space might be conceived or designed by people in power, the people in the government, the architects, the funders, the technocrats, the people who design how a space needs to be created or conceived. And to Lefebvre, it is not sufficient for us to study just that. We also need to study what the lived reality of these spaces are. And for him, there is a world of a difference between how spaces are often conceived and how they are lived. Just to give you a very broad example, if you were to think about how technocrats design a market, they think about a market as a space for economic exchange of goods and commodities. But in a Lefebvrean sense, a market is beyond that, right? There are relationships that are formed in a that could be formed in a market. People might get into fights. People might make friends. People might, antisocial elements might come and vandalize the market after. And to Lefebvre, all of these are lived realities of that space that the market is. So to him, understanding the difference between how spaces are conceived and how the lived realities outlive them, that gap is where we can understand how the public sphere challenges power structures through these spaces. And this is the framework that I went on to use then to look at the evolution of spaces or public spaces in Kerala. Now, this gives us some really interesting insights into looking at the history of Kerala, because then we get to revisit the social history of Kerala, not just from a lens of social relations, but also spatial relations. For example, laws of purity and pollution that were extremely stark in Kerala, like we know, because there wasn't just untouchability, there was unapproachability in Kerala, or unseeability, where you weren't allowed to be seen by people from castes that were considered below yours. All of these also become ways in which the spatiality or the geography of Kerala was divided using very strict caste rules, right? So this begins to change then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of the other things that a spatial analysis allows us to do is that, unlike the public sphere, where it creates these imaginary binaries of between a public and a private, the home being the private and the public being everything outside the home, a spatial analysis lets us move beyond this. And I hope I have some more time to come back to this in the discussion. But the idea of thinking about the home as a space was one of the most revealing things that comes out to me in my own work. So the way we think about the home and how it flips the idea of public and private on its head, especially when we look at questions of how gender can be contextualized when we look at the home as a space. So this opens up, spatial analysis opened up the possibilities to do this. What also happens in the 20th century is that spaces that were earlier shut off for people who belong to caste oppressed communities, there were agitations, widespread agitations across the state to appropriate these spaces. And I'm thinking about spaces like streets, like temples, like four squares, like Kavalas. We know the Vaikyam Satyagraha, the Guruvayur Satyagraha, all of which were basically to open up existing spaces like streets to allow people from all castes to use the space. So automatically what is happening there is that the spatial practices that had dictated who could and couldn't use these spaces was starting to change as a result of these agitations, as a result of how people were starting to perceive a new kind of spatiality in the 20th century as a result of the changes that were happening. And of course, all the other changes in the public sphere of the literary public, and all of this is happening in the background and is guiding some of these changes that we see more spatially as well. What also happens over the course of the 20th century is that we see the creation of new spaces that hadn't existed before. Now I'm thinking of spaces like reading rooms, like tea shops, like film clubs that come up in the 1960s and afterwards in Kerala, youth clubs, sport clubs, libraries. All of these also come up in the 20th century as new spaces where, in theory, people belonging to different backgrounds could all come and interact as equals. There is a visible absence of how gender is dealt with within these cases. And again, that is something that I'm happy to discuss when we get to that in a bit as well, about what it means, those invisibilities that exist. Does it mean that they were, quote unquote, progressive and public, like they claim to be, or what were the new kinds of visibilities that were happening as this change happens? Such an analysis also helps us contextualize the more contemporary changes that we see in Kerala today. Kerala Paranam, the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad's work from 2006, makes an observation that was really interesting for me, which is that at that point, out of the people that they interviewed, they found out that close to 40 or 50% of the people had agreed to were already part of some sort of cooperative societies or self-help groups, as opposed to only 15 to 16% who were part of political party organizations. What it was suggesting is that the way people are engaging with politics was starting to change in the contemporary period. And this came up even when I was doing field work, where people who are involved quite actively in the art and cultural scene were saying that people were increasingly interested in coming and making a political point, but they didn't want to do it under political party banners or trade union banners, but they were still political. They wanted to come and express. So what seems to be happening is that there seems to be an increasingly organic way of socializing that is emerging in contemporary Kerala that is around what I've called the floating public, where people come together for issues like arts, like theater, like music, like human rights, like environmental causes, feminist causes, film, uh, and then they sort of, that is the affinity that brings them together in that space. And these kind of changes are happening in the more contemporary period. And I sort of end with that in the book. But the main arguments, sort of zooming out, what I'm making in the book is one, that modernity looked at through a lens of analyzing it from spaces, it becomes very evident that it is an ongoing process of constant negotiations, that it's not an end product in some sense where we have this progressive Kerala that, that is there in a bubble and that isn't interacting with any other part of the world. And what seems to be the case is that there is an ongoing constant negotiation that is manifesting itself spatially when we look at the history of political public spheres in Kerala in the 20th century. What also becomes important is that we cannot begin to understand this without looking at the lived experiences that people have. And this is where I think, like I was mentioning earlier, the idea of the subversion of binaries is an important point. And I just want to make a very quick example here. I mean, a couple of examples if I had the time. But sort of, for example, Mannathu Padmanabhan in his autobiography writes about how, when the Vaikam Satyagraha is happening, which means that Mannathu Padmanabhan is already a public figure, he's already a social reformer, he's already seen as a secular leader. There is an incident that happens in his house when the Vaikam Satyagraha is happening, where two people who were part of the agitation, who belonged to the caste below his, come to his house to tell him about the proceedings that was happening on the day. So he says in his autobiography that when these two people who come to visit him come to his house, he realizes that, being courteous, his mother offers them food. And then there is a dilemma, because Mannatha says that he's never actually sat and had food with people from the caste oppressed community before. And he was thinking about the moral stress that this would bring on to his mother, the fact that he was having to sit and eat here. And there's a really interesting insight that we get from it, where in some sense this idea of progressive politics or secularism is not something that goes out from his house, because he's already a public figure, he's already a secular leader, and then it is in the house that we see the contradictions between his image as a public secular person versus his conservative household that he comes from. There are similar examples from from women who were writing at the time and about their experiences of living in the house, where they speak about how carrying a pamphlet that was given to them publicly in the house was unthinkable for them, right? What does that mean then? Where does that leave us with definitions of public and private? If they're thinking about carrying it publicly in the house, there is another contradiction there that's really interesting. So these negotiations become even more interesting to look at. And the contradictions like these examples show of between how a space, even a space like a home, is conceived and the lived realities of these spaces becomes something that we need to contend with when we look at the history. The broad argument then is that at any point in history, when we look, at least in the period that I have looked at, every time there has been a hegemonic power that has tried to exert its power or dominance over society, be it caste in the pre-independence period, or the post-colonial state, and on caste in new forms in the post-colonial state, or the neoliberal capitalism that we see in the more contemporary period, they have always tried to dominate the spatiality in society in some form or the other. And despite these attempts, it is from within these spaces that new forms of resistance have often emerged by using these spaces in very creative forms as a medium of protest. And this is the broad argument that the monograph is trying to make, looking at the 19th and 20th centuries in Kerala. I'm going to conclude now with the two sort of broad areas that I was saying that I hope to take this book in. One is the obvious question of what happens to these spaces increasingly with the onset of digital media, the coming of television, and the last 2 or 3 decades in general. What does the coming of the internet, the coming of social media do to these spaces. And we are seeing some really interesting ways in which existing or older spaces have been appropriated into digital media. One obvious one is films. How, increasingly we see movies like Drishyam, Ustad Hotel. We see this in Maheshindra Pradigaram. All of these movies, we see the tea shop as being sort of some sort of a fulcrum where there is a conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist, and this pushes the story forward in some sense. But we're also seeing news channels, for example, come out from their studios into the tea shops, into the beaches where people are going for a morning walk, especially around election times. We see this where they come onto a kavala and you have all the contestants standing there and they all have, a public forum of sorts where politics is discussed. So it's very interesting to look about how these adaptations have changed. But there's another way that I've been thinking of more recently in which digital spaces have changed this. And this is something that came up even when I was doing my interviews, which is that we are now seeing a generation of people in Kerala who grew up in the 1960s and 70s around the conventional public spaces that I mentioned, spaces like youth clubs and the film clubs and the sports clubs, the Vayanashala. Multiple people told me that although they have now, all of his friends that he knew from then are in different parts of the world. One person said that they've made a WhatsApp group and they've named it after the youth club or the film club that they were a part of when they were growing up. But when I probed them a little bit more, it was really interesting to hear how they thought the nature of discussions were very different, though, in these spaces. One person telling me that at some point, they decided not to discuss politics on those WhatsApp groups anymore because it got into a heated argument and people started, getting very cold with each other. So I think there's some really interesting changes in what the terms of engagement have been in these new forms on digital spaces. The final point, and this is something that we discussed also at the Madison South Asia conference late last year, which is whether or not academically this is also a good time for us to move beyond this Kerala exceptionalism in some form that has dictated a lot of academic works that we've done or that we've seen for many, many decades before. And one sense, like the increasing agitations that we see across the world, like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, have suggested that there is a possibility for solidarities that transcend territorial or geographical boundaries, right? So it might be useful to think about some of these questions. And this is something that I did in a paper that I published recently with my supervisor, where we looked at Northern Ireland and Kerala, which might seem like completely different societies that don't really have much in common with each other. But we had a very specific interest. We were looking at the 1990s as a point of departure, because in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement happens in the 90s. And in Kerala, like we know, decentralization happens in the 90s. And we're interested in the question of how these political changes also brought about a certain change in spatiality. And we're asking a very basic question: what can these case studies and their experience over the last 3 decades tell us about what might or might not work in different cases, and what kind of lessons can we get that might be interesting to look at? And the paper's open access for anyone interested, but you can see that we got to some really interesting questions, not necessarily answers, pertaining to questions of participatory democracy and what it might look like in the 21st century and in the contemporary world. So that's another sort of possible trajectory that I think there is some merit in exploring in the future, and I hope to do this. I'm going to stop with that. Again, I haven't gone into examples or readings or anything of that sort. I'm happy to do that at some point. But for now, I'll stop here. I'm at 25 minutes, so I hope I didn't run too much over time. And I look forward to comments, both Dilip from Carmel, Dilip, and from everyone else here. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hari, for brilliantly summarizing that book, so lucid and crisp. I would now invite Professor Menon to, engage with the book and the argument.
Thank you. Thank you, Varghese. Thank you, Hari. Thank you, Kamal. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I think Hari did an excellent summary, so none of us has to read the book, so which is a good thing. I personally have interacted with Hari over several years. He was at the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, and we discussed his thesis as it was being written on hikes and over coffee and so on. And I also wrote a foreword to the book, which was deeply appreciative. So I shall now present some comments which are perhaps not so deeply appreciative, just so that we can have a substance for a more engaged discussion. It's interesting that, what I liked about the book is that after all the ritual obeisance to Habermas, Habermas, after all, wrote the book in 1962, the year that I was born, right? So it's a long, long time ago. It's a book perhaps we should stop reading. And so when we think about the idea of the public sphere, in that there is an implicit Hegelianism that first few have the public sphere, then some have the public sphere, then all have the public sphere, right? There's a kind of telos that we are moving towards. And Hari's work actually tries to move away from that and think about the idea of the public sphere in a much more fractured, conjunctural, transient, everyday kind of way, which I think is a distinct departure from the kinds of studies that we now no longer need to go back to. So that's my first thing, and which I shall develop on that in a while. But I think the more interesting thing to think with would be, what does it mean to think with the idea of society in India where we don't have society? Yes, this is what Ambedkar pointed to. We don't even have sociality, right? That our entire life is governed by strictures about presence, about absence, about exclusion, that we might have the idea of an ideal public sphere, but many are excluded from it. And many are excluded from it under pain of death, right? And this is something that anyone who's taught at the University of Hyderabad knows. I mean, Varghese and I were both people who taught there. And when you come from a place like Telangana, where there's a large proportion of the Dalit population and a huge power differential, so what does it mean to talk about society in the first place? Are these all ideas that we've carried from elsewhere and we treasure in this kind of way that we need to become more and more like someplace elsewhere, which seemingly has these? The other thing to think about is that, I mean, to take a very simple example, we don't even marry one another as Hindus, right? There's a deep biological trench, as Ambedkar puts it, that runs through society. So what does it mean to talk about society at all? I mean, what are the categories that we need to think with instead of leaping away to categories like the public sphere and so on and so forth? Questions of touch, questions of fraternity, what Ambedkar called the absence of maitri among people. When we think about all of this, I think we need to bring in these categories which are very real, which are very plungent, which are very resonant, if at all we are to think about India and think about change. So when we think about people becoming a part of public society or public spheres, we must also think about Ambedkar's phrase that as untouchables, we are not a part of society, we are a part apart. And that is what we are dealing with in India, right? So that's the first thing that I'd like to put before you. The second thing is that what can we do with theorizing with the various words that you put into italics, for example? You suggest that, look, when we think about the public sphere, when we think about society, we can think about words like Alkutam, we can think about words like Kutaima, Pudujanam, which Uday Kumar has dwelt with in some detail. But all of these are left in italics. They're not theorized. The theory comes from elsewhere. So you substitute Habermas with Henri Lefebvre, right? But at the end, the ways in which people talk about living or not living together is something that is set aside. It's incarcerated, imprisoned in these italics. What would it mean to theorize those italics? And this is part of the venture that I'm trying to do as well, and I hope many more are trying to do. How do we start theorizing from our spaces, from our languages, and so on? So this thinking with the italics is the second point that I'd like to make, where I think we need to now, in many senses, think beside a theoretical tradition that weighs like a nightmare on us, right? Where we leap away nimbly to Western categories that are central to a certain definition of a very narrow history of 300 years in Europe. So I don't want to belabor the point. So the first point. The second point is trying to think about ways in which we can think about the public sphere, people's involvement in it. And I've been reading Kanipayur Shankaran Namburipaat's Atmagatha, which is, as you know, a very peculiar autobiography because it tells you very little about him. Right? And you don't get to know much about Kanipayur through reading this autobiography. What you get to know are descriptions of objects like the umbrella, the stylus, the bus stop, the cinema hall, the restaurant. And these are all spaces where the idea of caste gets dispersed. right? And it's not about people's presence, but the fact of invisibility that bothers Kani Payur here. That you go to a cinema hall and there are all kinds of people there, and they're invisible, they're unreadable, they're illegible in terms of caste. So that presence is not about a vocal, active presence, it's about a presence that unsettles, which is what disturbs Kani Payur much more. So that's another way of thinking about public spaces that we could do. So when we concentrate on the triumphal narrative of Ayyangali's cart, the Jathas, right, which 15 to 20,000 peasants marching up to Kalyatanayanar and Karakatida Vida and so on and so forth, we have to think about the fact that there are many other frictions and many other anxieties that are being generated in Kerala even now. And that's where we could possibly think about the very act of living together in some of these modern spaces. In Kerala, for example, the new apartment buildings that have come up, the fact that one could say progressively that these apartment buildings have people who are Muslims, Hindus, upper caste, lower caste, everybody living together. But who gets to use the lift, the elevator? That the servants use the service lift and the tenants use the lift, which servants and domestics are explicitly forbidden from using. Right? So how do we think with these spaces, these recalcitrant spaces where we're no longer talking about caste, we're talking about class, we're talking about certain kinds of aspirational forms of living, certain newer forms of distancing, which are based on earlier forms of distancing, the idea of the watchman, right? Who keeps people out, the idea of who gains entry into malls, how do you have to be dressed in order to gain entry into malls? So multiple questions of this kind, which do not allow us to adopt the earlier categories. Do we have society in India? No. Do we have the limited sociality? Perhaps yes. Right? So that's the question that we need to think about. The other question also is about where there is this rather hermetic understanding of Kerala as consisting largely of Malayalis, but now increasingly we have to think about the presence of Assamese, Bengalis, the various prejudices that are generating about them, the various categories that are coming in everyday speech, inflect, so that everybody who comes from outside is a Bengali, for example. You find this in Malayalam cinema as well. So what is this doing to the notion of public spaces? What are the elements of caste, class, color, language, multiple inflections? I mean, in India, we're very, very good at separating people from each other. This is what Ambedkar writes about unrelentingly, right? We discover more and more and more categories of exclusion. So what are those that are emerging in Kerala? The other thing to think about is what is the price paid? Right? What is the price paid by the caste body, the gendered body, the queer body in order to enter the public space? To take a very simple example, which is unconnected to these three examples, think about the idea of the Pandi Bhojanam, right? Which originally meant that Shaktan Dambaran could eat in front of or watch Brahmins eat. He couldn't eat with them, but he could watch Brahmins eat. That was what Pandi Bhojanam actually meant. But now, in the early 20th century, Pandi Bhojanam means everybody dines together. What is the price paid? That the meal will be vegetarian. Right? Think about the Onam meal. So this is the question that we have to ask. What is the constant price being paid? What is being invisibilized even as space is opened up? So think about some instances, for example, like when Penneltha came up in the 1990s. It was very clear that the male literary establishment did not want these women there. They did not want them to be speaking about certain things, particularly the indexing of the écriture féminine, the French feminists, the talk of the body, all of which embarrassed and shocked these very patriarchal men who then wrote reams of ugly prose in newspapers and in magazines. And we all know the people who wrote these things, right? So the price of entry here is that to be part of this public sphere or society, there are still various forms of disciplining and policing that are happening. And this can be seen in the visual politics of inclusion and exclusion, right? So we can say, for example, like in the films of the 1980s, the films of the present, the difference between, let's say, the Mohanlal films of the 1980s and something like Kamatipadam is that now you have Dalit bodies, but that the price of the Dalit body is to be mute, is to be dark, is to be violent, right? So just to have the body present in itself doesn't actually allow us to think about inclusion in any kind of progressive teleological sense. And very interestingly, and this is the idea that I've been working with and which I'm writing a paper on, central to the politics of inclusion is udukkam, right? That you discipline people even as they enter, whether it's men, women, queer bodies, Dalit bodies, and so on and so forth. Think about that instance, that absolutely innocent instance of Rehana Fatima having her body painted by her children. And this became a huge issue among the Muslim community, particularly males among certain sections of males among the Muslim community. Large sections of the Kerala patriarchal community, and the criticism was presented in terms of the fact that, look, this is exploitation of children. And she, of course, said, look, this is ridiculous. These are children whom I've breastfed, right? It's not as if they're being exposed to my body for the first time. And the High Court sensibly decided that this whole case had to be thrown out. But again, the price, the udukkam, that is constantly being practiced, the price of inclusion, the price of presence. We need to think about the huge cost because we are not yet a society. We're still struggling to find forms of sociality. Finally, the final point I'd like to make is you began with the ready to wait, right? I mean, and that's an interesting example to begin with, because these are women who are exercising agency by saying that we do not want to enter the public sphere.
Yeah.
Their agency is in excluding themselves, saying, look, we don't want to enter Sabarimala. So how do we think about these kinds of issues? Are they perversions of this idea of democratic inclusion? Are they ways in which we say that, look, what we have is a very complex public sphere? The word complex covers many sins, right? So is that what we're thinking about here? How do we understand the self-exclusion that was being practiced by ready to wait, the paradox of presence absence, or the present absence, or absent presence, or however you choose to put it? And my final point, and I'll stop here, is that this is something that I've begun to think about, particularly with regard to my work as well, that what is it that we lose when we concentrate only on issues like caste? In the end, we write Hindu histories of Kerala, right? The histories of Muslims, Christians, people who don't consider themselves Hindus get excluded. And this is something that I'm struggling with. I mean, rather late in the day, one would say, but I'm still struggling with that. Our choice of topic actually determines one's ontology, is determined by one's ontology. And this is, in some sense, the tragedy of our social sciences in India, that Hindus work on Hindus, Muslims work on Muslims, and Christians work on Christians. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Menon. I think what Harikrishnan has indicated towards the end, the ways in which we should try and think about overcoming the self-assumed exceptionalism of Kerala. I think all these points that you have made in your comment basically brilliantly points to those possibilities and the complexities involved with that, possibility of going beyond the exceptionalism. Thank you very much. And now may I request Dr. Christie to come in and give reflections on the book.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending this event. Thank you, Hari, for inviting me to be a discussant for this book discussion. Thank you, Aisha, for organizing. Thank you, Dilip, for these very thoughtful comments. There is a lot to think about. First of all, congratulations, Hari, for writing this book. Any book is a culmination of a lot of many years of hard work and consistent hard work and commitment. So I'm very glad to see that your hard work has come into fruition in the form of this book. I mean, I haven't had a chance to engage with Hari's work closely before, but I came to know of Hari's work in 2019 when Hari wrote to me about his interest in spaces. And he also mentioned to me that he came across one of my articles. And so he was discussing further about his interest in spaces. So I was very happy to see his email at that time because um, my interest in spaces was in connecting spaces as a category in understanding gender and caste. So, I mean, I was always surprised by how the centrality of land or centrality of space in understanding our society is not so much of a focus of much of our scholarship. I mean, it's always there in passing, but it's not a central category of analysis in many of our works. So as I was like figuring out some of my um, new work, that's when we talked about it. And I'm very glad that after 6 years, your book came out. So I'm very glad to discuss this. I mean, I do have all kinds of comments, but it is also engaging with it is also some kind of celebration, right? So most of my comments and what stayed with me as I was reading this book is his focus on space and his both conceptual as well as analytical, in the sense engaging with all these materials you have laid out in the book. So what does this focus on space means for scholarship on Kerala? That's what stayed with me. So that's the focus of my comments as well. So as you laid out in your discussion, as you laid out in your presentation, a spatial history of modernity in Kerala is much needed, as there is more need for such scholarship to complement the much available, say, political history or literary histories of Kerala. So with the use of interdisciplinary methods and frameworks, your book presents as an opportunity to once again think beyond disciplinary boundaries. So, of course, the ways in which I approach spaces is probably not the same, even methodological tools and ways in which you analyze are probably from a different vantage point. As you said, you are trained in political science. So it's very interesting to see how you look at space from these different disciplinary backgrounds. So that was something very interesting for me to read in your book. Also, as Professor Dilip has already laid out, how you use public sphere and the need to, think beyond concepts of public sphere and so on. And that's where you bring in space, the analytical category of space is much more enabling in understanding various kinds of horizontal relationships in terms of, and another point, I think in some places you bring that out, but there is a lot more scope to understand spaces as much more embodied in terms of all kinds of inequalities, be it gender, be it caste or religion. So that's the scope I feel space, using space as an analytical point can bring to Kerala studies scholarship. Because what is missed out in a lot of discussions is this spatiality and bodies, which could radically challenge a lot of our, scholarship, which which focuses on time, or which is also disembodied in some ways. So that possibility is something that I feel would be very promising for future scholarship using space. So your book, in that sense, opens up some thoughts along those lines, which is very promising. And of course, you do use the disciplinary uh, disciplinary notes from philosophy, sociology, and political science as you in most parts of the book, and you use these frameworks to read some moments of Kerala from the early 20th century and lays out the contemporary socio-political trends. So that sounds like a very ambitious project, because you are, the time span itself uh, is very difficult to bring together in a single book. So now I'll discuss a little bit about space and how it figures in your book. Space is often, in a lot of scholarship, is discussed as the site of happenings in passing, without much analytical attention to the dynamism of the place, specifically in social science research on Kerala. So what we mean by dynamism is that a dynamism that is brought together by the merging of the material, conceptual, imagined, and lived everyday interactions. As scholars of space like Henri Lefebvre, Michel de Soto, and Edward Soya distinctly lay out in their works, which is what Hari also explained in his presentation earlier. So material space is often referred to as place in common parlance, in terms of nourishing, changing, often destroying our lives in irrevocable ways, like all kinds of natural calamities, building things, everything can happen in the physical material space, which is also the site of all kinds of contestations as well, the claims over land, the claims over resources, and so on. Conceptual and imagined space is the realm where maps, thought, and feelings about spaces of various kinds come together. For instance, we have a concept of imagined ideas of places we have not been to, from maps, images, movies, and so on. And we also attach feelings of various kinds, warmth, cold, affection, and so on, to places. Michel de Soto argues that a place becomes space from this merging of materiality and imagination. However, Lefebvre's focus on the politics of space is distinct from Soto, though they are contemporaries. Soto doesn't engage with the politics of space so much, though he kind of forcefully brings out the everydayness of space. So that's what makes Lefebvre's work distinct, this possibility of politics within lived spaces. So it is this politics of space in Kerala that this book, Spatial History of Modernity, very well lays out. So I hope this books like this encourage us to consider spatiality as an analytical lens rather than dealing with spaces as the passive site on which things happen. A place or site is often mentioned as an administrative category, but not necessarily discussed as actively co-creating the sociality of that space. There is a lot of scholarship about different places in Kerala. For instance, even I think the Aishore name itself resonates with the centrality of coastal land in Kerala's existence, or in shaping Kerala itself. So, and also all this work on Malabar coast, such as that of Mahmud's and many others' works. Also the works, the book Plantation Crisis by Jay Sheelan. All these works do deal with places in one way or the other. So I think your book's most significant contribution among all this is in highlighting the dynamic production of spaces, historically and in contemporary times. So it is an exposition of the ideological production of spaces in relation to gender, caste, and religion. And it also features the merging of both ideological and material spaces, in which major socio-political events happen in the 20th century and also in the last one decade. So I think another very attractive feature of the book is the many photographs that you have used, and also the illustrations, which really give you a sense of that place. So this is something very interesting when I have also mostly worked with text in most of my earlier works, but I started working on, places and spaces in a more, in a more, as a site where things merge together. The focus shift towards those real places in very in a very different way.
Mm.
So which also goes back to the idea of embodied spaces, right? The how you bring that into an experience and feeling. So that's very useful. Those photos very very useful. How you brought them together. And but going back to Lefebvre, I would like to raise some points to take our discussion forward.
Mhm.
As the book explains, Lefebvre identifies three different modes of production, which you showed us. Um, that is spatial practices in the physical space, representations of spaces through maths and so on,
Yeah.
and representational space, which is the lived space.
Yeah.
And Lefebvre's lived space is not merely the site of domination and resistance, but an abstract space of production. And I think that's his major contribution to expanding Marxian frameworks as well, because he doesn't see, of course, he is concerned about the politics of domination and resistance, but he also leaves space for many abstract tactile moves, tactiles and spatial moves that can happen between domination and resistance. So that's also something that makes his work so interesting. And I see that like scholars like Gopal Guru, many of them use his work also for this kind of, depth that it brings to understanding spaces and inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
So the Lefebvrean framework is attentive to the spaces through which production is facilitated. So there is a lot of attention and to the specifics without necessarily grouping them together as this act or that act specifically. So he is interested not merely in the ideology of domination and resistance, but the numerous ways in which it is actually lived through. This could be the space of tactics, indifference, pleasure, or the site of numerous other engagements, but all politically mediated in one way or the other. So in some ways, he is neither dualistic. He deals with them, but he doesn't really fully, cater to the dualistic framework. But that doesn't mean he is post-humanistic, like several other, or several other scholars of space and affect sometimes deviate, sometimes go along those lines where politics is not the basis of the production of art or production of spaces. But Lefebvre is distinctly attentive to the politics of production of spaces. So this also not easy to, I think, bring out within an analysis because of this complexity. I mean, complexity doesn't explain much, as Professor Dilip has already noted. But so this thinking beyond this dualistic perspective, that's where he brings in the politics of grassroots, like we have discussed the ideas of autogestion and so on, right? So therefore, within a Lefebvrean understanding, the grassroots attempts to expand democracy does not directly translate to the category of resistance. So then the two questions that emerge from this discussion are, in what ways can we understand the spatial history of Kerala without placing the secular and religious as contrary to each other? There are glimpses of answers in this book where you discuss reimagining the self, that is their bodily space, as an important part of the social reform movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. I wish we could read more about this bodily space in the book, which in political geographer Edward Soya's words is the space where geography and the human meet politically, affectively, and beyond. Though Lefebvre does not explicitly mention bodily space, his lived space is closer to this bodily space. He doesn't use that word, of course. So the everyday tactical spatial moves between the religious and the secular, in some sense, is an important feature of Indian democracy, as many scholars have already stated earlier. As we know, the secular itself has been argued as comprising of many tactical moves in India as well as in Kerala. It would be interesting to think more about such spatial moves within and beyond the secular and the religious rather than between them. As several studies have already stated, and some studies still pit them against each other. In some parts of the book, for instance, in chapter 4, I quote, thus, from being mutually exclusive and caste-specific, education gradually emerged as a secular space in the 20th century Kerala. It played an important role in addressing, albeit to a very small extent in the beginning, the disconnect that had existed previously between the representational spaces of the upper caste Hindus and those of the lower caste, unquote. So such parts in several places convey the impression of the secular as already settled. But if the secular was spatialized, discussed as lived spaces could have provided us with a spatialized secular. Indeed, in chapter 5, personal accounts of parents about passing on religious education at home vis-a-vis secular public schools is a very insightful conversation. So you do bring that in some places. So such insights do show the numerous ways in which the secular and religious are lived through differently in different spaces. So I wish we had more such excerpts to, understand this friction. This brings us to a second question about the methodological tools to write spatial history of modernity in Kerala. A spatial history of modernity uses your text uses text and interviews skillfully along with photographs and illustrations. There are several autobiographies that you have used as well. So to expand on the dynamism of spaces, what other methodological tools can we use so that land, space, geography is not reduced to what is just out there on which things happen? I'm also posing this question in the context of interventions of several indigenous scholars, advancing the concept of indigenous place thought. Places increasingly becoming the site of, different ways of thinking about inequalities across the world, especially especially several indigenous scholars have made a lot of progress in developing this framework. For instance, Vanessa Watts, who is an indigenous scholar, says in her work that the land needs to be considered as alive and thinking, and that humans and non-humans derive agency through the extensions of these thoughts. So bringing in the dynamism of the place, the land. So these perspectives, of course, there is a way in which they are also trying to think beyond the Western categories of, production and circulation, distribution, and so on. But they are also acutely aware of the powers of imperialism and, the other sorts of domination from which these new kinds of frameworks are emerging. So what would be the methodological tools that we can develop to capture this intertwined agency of the physical, symbolic, and social space in the scholarship on Kerala? So that's a broad question, not necessarily directed at you. However, I also have a specific question about some parts in which caste is discussed as it is, not as an intersectional relationship with religion, gender, or class. So this is a discussion we have already had for the last 20, 30 years. So this space of merging intersectional social relations would have added another layer to the analysis of spaces in Kerala, which I hope probably you have plans to address that later or maybe in future research. So these are some of my questions, and despite all these questions, your biggest contribution is in catalyzing this conversation on spaces, because it's a full-length book on spaces of Kerala. So a book covering such a long time span of spatial history of modernity is a substantial addition to the Kerala Studies Scholarship. As I said, it introduces fresh ways of analyzing space from a social science perspective, which in itself must have been a very difficult task to do. So congratulations, Hari, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christie, for those very insightful comments, particularly for bringing those issues of pre-governed binaries as well as the question of intersectionality. I'm sure Heidi will have a response now to both of the discussants, and then we can take a few questions. And for those who are attending the meeting, please feel free to type your questions in the chat or raise your hands for asking questions directly. Over to you, Hari.
Thank you. I won't take too much time because I can also engage with you individually, like on these specific questions. But fascinating, like really sort of interesting questions. Some of which I have a response to, some of which I don't. But I think to Dilip, I think the point that you were making about sort of theorizing the italics is something, and I remember we've also discussed this when I was over in Johannesburg as well, thinking about this, and this is the like at the moment in the book, the only bits I do that to some extent is looking at the works of like Gopal Guru Sarukai, their work on everyday socials, the work that they do in Crack Mirror, and where they're trying to very passionately and very like importantly, in my opinion, sort of argue for that shift, that looking away from sort of Eurocentric theories to focus on the praxis, on the idea of looking at the lived experiences. And yes, I think like at least when I was working on this, I didn't know of too many people who had theorized this beyond that point. And even for Gopal Guru and Sarukai, I remember I engaged with it, but they also invoke Lefebvre more in the sense of what Christie was saying. The idea of embodied spaces, the idea of body as a space, is something that they're using quite a bit. I found it's really useful for me to think with. But I think the honest response is also that partly because I was approaching this as a political science scholar, it changes, like you were saying, Carmel, it changes how I was looking at space. And I think that is why a lot of the other elements have been left out. And I'm sort of conscious as well. And like Dilip was saying, the other idea of, when we think about caste, we don't think about other things. And I know one of the things that the monograph needs is I engage with sort of the Hindu society as such, which is, like Dilip, like you were saying, the problem with most of scholarship that we have on Kerala is this. And I'm conscious I haven't engaged enough with sort of beyond the missionary movement or the early works that exist on the Christian. Some of my interview respondents were also from non-Hindu backgrounds. But again, my work on them is more looking at their engagement with spaces like temples or with spaces that are more secular, quote unquote, which is a limitation that I'm well aware of, that I hope to sort of improve on if and when I take this forward. The point on residence welfare associations, the gated community, is really interesting because I actually thought about this, especially during the pandemic. Because when the pandemic happens, one of the first press conferences that the chief minister does, one of the active networks that he mentions, apart from the state institutions, is how resident welfare associations need to step in. And it was very telling for me how, suddenly it is a part of this large network of informal, non-institutional or semi-institutional civil society, put in that sense, which I found really interesting. I remember thinking about this when that press conference happened as well. And that was my point. And then, sorry, I've just been scribbling all over the place. With Carmel, I think like we don't have to do this now, but I'm actually curious, like you were saying about how because you come from a cultural studies background, how your analysis of space would be a little different. And I was curious about that. Just because I think it's something that I'm thinking about, like I've mentioned in the past, and something that I'm interested in. So maybe we can speak about that later and what kind of sort of similarities or differences. The larger methodological question, I don't know. The use of photographs and doodles was very conscious, and I I was saying to both of you, I think I had to fight with the publishers to make sure that they get that in there. And this is also on a tangent now, but something that we've been doing with Allah, the blog that I was mentioning earlier, is to think about how do we find more effective ways of disseminating research that's happening, because there's all of this really interesting work that's happening that gets limited to word or text only journal articles that, you know, a handful of people read. Whereas I feel like using visual medium has, at least for me, allowed me to think about these questions in a different light and help me take the research to a different audience. And this has happened more in the consequent works that I've done, where I'm trying to incorporate more and more visual elements in photography. And I think what it has opened up in terms of collaborative research is, and like I can do an entire talk on this separately, but I think there are so many possibilities about exploring those methodologies. And I'm encouraged with a lot of new scholarship that I'm reading that is taking some of those on board. So I think we are automatically moving beyond that puritanism of, oh, like it only needs to be text and this and that. But what other tools exist, I don't know. I mean, I will submit your guidance and suggestions on this if anyone has any. But thank you so much for all of your points. Well taken. I've scribbled and I'll make better notes at some point and think about these and get back as well. But thank you so much. I think there's a couple of questions.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Would you like to see and respond,
Yeah,
Dr. Hari?
I think I can see them here. There. Thanks for the great presentation. I'm curious whether your book specifically explores or if you have thoughts on how Gulf migration in its evolving forms dynamically deconstruct the ideological material space of Kerala. You may have touched on this in your talk already, but I'd love to hear more. I'm very happy to be a part of the coming historical. I was wondering whether this new public sphere is emerging in Kerala in the context of colonialism. Particularly, I'm talking in the context of recent publication, Rayatwari, Company, State and Political Economy by Abhilash Malel, which criticizes the fame of Enkampa society in Parambu Paraida Vyavastha in Kerala, which widely conceptualized the history of in Kerala. The book talks about the Angadigal or market where people can gather and sell their cheap goods in the 18 and 19. Do we need more critical concern with the existing historiography while thinking about the public space in the context? Okay. Two useful questions. I hope you had the chance to get a sense of what I was saying. The first question is on looking at Gulf migration. I don't address Gulf migration directly in the book, although some of the respondents I speak to were speaking about how the political and economic changes towards the end of the 20th century, the Gulf migration included, had some drastic changes on how sort of ideology was or political ideology was seen in the second half of the 20th century. And in some sense, I think it fits in because like one of the things that I do in the book is look at how the post-colonial state emerges as a dominant structure to a level where it starts to attempt to dominate any forms of dissent that were emerging within these social spaces against the state. And this is, I'm thinking of the left movements that emerged in the 1960s and the likes. And some of the interview respondents I spoke to were speaking about how a lot of the youngsters at the time were feeling very disengaged with the politics, even sympathizers of the left who had been, on that side of the political spectrum. By the 70s and 80s, there is a certain disenchantment that kicks in partly as a result of the responses that they see that the state is giving to these movements. And at least one person told me that, this was the period when he personally migrated to the Gulf because he had a sense of, there's no point of holding on to these things. We have a family to support and everything. And then he was talking about how, like, a lot of the people that he knows also, it was a culmination of all of these social, political, and economic things that was happening towards the end of the of the 20th century that was leading to some of the changes. So in that sense, yes, I have, but I haven't actually engaged with Gulf migration as such. Would be my answer. The second question on historiography, I mean, Dilip might be in a better place to answer this. I don't know if you have anything to add. The question, I haven't read the book, the Raitwari and Company, State and Political Economy, and so I wouldn't know specifically about the issues engaged in the book. I don't know, Dilip, have you had a chance?
I wrote a foreword for that as well. So I have read the book. But, no, but I think this is your day. I don't want to get into a longer discussion on. No, but I think Vadivel is raising an important point about the pre-modern spaces or colonial spaces of public interaction, which are as fragmented perhaps as the contemporary present. So the markets, for example, is a marvelous, the Angadi. The
Mm.
Angadi as a space of interaction which is governed by commerce rather than only by caste, class, gender, and so on. So the fishwife is present as much as the Mapla moneylender, as much as the Hindu Karyasthan, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a whole set of issues there, but
Yeah, no, I mean, I like I said, I haven't. The little bit that came up in my work about this was more to do with how, at least in the early modern phases, a lot of these linkages in spaces like markets were still horizontal linkages in some sense. In the sense, it wasn't people from caste oppressed communities engaging on a constant basis with upper caste Hindus. It was more like, similar castes across religions engaging with each other. So, like a caste oppressed Hindu had access to a lower caste or a caste oppressed Christian market space or a shop, but not an upper caste one. So there was some of those mentions, but like the book sounds really interesting. I haven't had a chance to take a look at it, but I'd love to. Thank you for your question, Sharon. I see somebody has a hand raised. I don't know if they.
Yeah, there is Vadivel Chinnaduri
Hi,
raised his hand.
Vadivel. Hello.
Hi.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Great presentation and great commentary by both professors. So I'm a geography student. I'm a geography graduate student, and we read a lot of people on space, people who worked on space like Henri Lefebvre, and and also the Dorian Massey. So and Edward Sojan, like and on so on so on. So coming from India, particularly Tamil Nadu. Um, so what I in my PhD, I'm kind of interested in working at production of space, but away from not away from metropolitan spaces, like non-metropolitan, like specifically production of not just public space, but production of a space in a broader sense, but located in the non-metropolitan area. So my question to you is that I understand that you worked on the larger um, Kerala as a region, and also and looked at it through the production of modernity, like spatial history. But in my case, I'm kind of working in empirically a small town. Um, my question is like, how did you manage the theoretical, kind of, I wouldn't say dissonance, but also there is this big theorist from the West, like Lefebvre, and in my case, like Lefebvre, Massey, and everyone. But also on the other hand, like you rightly pointed out, Gopal Guru in India, and a lot more theorists who have written on space, like for example Periyar, and also Harikrishnan, and also there are political practice they did, like you mentioned how. So how did you bring these two together? Because seeing it only through the Western lens is a bit, at least I find it limited, because I don't know where to fit caste in it, or how to fit caste in it. So as a early career graduate student, I find it very limiting. So how did you find that one? And also the second question is a methodological one. In your case, you did take on the data is mostly text and few interviews you did, and also autobiography, life histories which been already written, and you took it as a text. But like in my case, or generally, no, if there is no archive, or if there is no written text available, if someone wants to reconstruct a spatial history of a place, what else is there to kind of reconstruct that? Because in one idea I have in my work is to uh, maybe partly through looking at the oral history of the town people, that one sense I have, or kind of a life history of them to what was it in their memory when they were younger. So that is one idea I have for now, but I'm kind of also looking at how to justify that, how else to expand that methodology. So that's my two questions, and great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Your work sounds really interesting. And like, I'd like to engage at some point if we can a bit more.
Yeah, sure.
On the theory question, I think it's like the discussants were already mentioning. in my case, I think for me, there was a bit of a cheating that I did in the sense that I knew why I didn't want to use, like I started with the limitations of the Habermasian model, which in some sense was for me useful because that made it easy for me to pick Lefebvre because I was very specific about why I didn't want to start with the Habermasian perspective. And for me, two things happened. One was Lefebvre's framework was allowing me to fill those specific gaps. There were other limitations, there were critiques, but for me, those specific gaps were being filled precisely because, like Lefebvre, to me, at least as a political science student, it didn't seem like he was making these universal assumptions. And that for me was the biggest problem to overcome. Like you were saying, when you start with the Habermasian model, the problem is like he tends to argue that that is how the public sphere will emerge in democracy, and that is not what is happening when we visit, especially in heterogeneous societies like ours where caste and gender is very crucial. So for me, in some sense, it was easy then to land on Lefebvre, and people like Gopal Guru Sarukai, but also people like Anike Javre, like Dilip was mentioning, Pandian's work was very useful for me.
Yeah.
And they were all, although they hadn't theorized as such in a way that Lefebvre had, I think they were all indicating towards similar ideas that fit, if that makes sense, within sort of the Lefebvrean framework. So that for me was my point. And like I'm very aware there is a limitation in the sense that it is still I've replaced like Dilip told me earlier at some point, I've replaced the German scholar with the French one, which is in part it is true, that is the case. But the point is, like, for what I was specifically trying to look, I felt that it fit sort of the theoretical framework. And that's why I keep reminding myself as well that it is a framework that I'm using. So I'm not it's not a grounded theory method. So I'm not like taking this theory and testing it in what I see in Kerala. I'm saying that this is the framework I'm using, and it is useful because it is telling us something about these spaces in Kerala that hasn't previously been told by other alternative theoretical frameworks that I use. So that is the extent to which I have adopted this work. And I think there are some more recent, like in Kerala alone, I know Sanal Mohan's work in recent times has looked at Lefebvre and the use of space a lot more. And there are other scholars who are also doing this. And the other thing I realize also in Kerala is there's a lot of not a lot, no, a lot would be an expansion. There were at least some literature that I came across that was in the regional language. Like there was a lot of work in Malayalam that was looking at space. Although again, it wasn't invoking Lefebvre, it wasn't theorizing it like Lefebvre. There were people even from the early 20th century whose works were thinking about space in a way that I was hoping to look at it. So rather than like using that as a point of departure, I was able to fit that snugly in some sense into the theory and the framework that I was using. So in that sense, I was maybe being a bit cheeky there with it. But again, I think that was the only way, in my opinion, that I could take up a work like this. That was a limitation. In terms of methodology, in the absence of archives or literature, I don't genuinely know. I would assume it has to be then speaking and like looking at oral histories and doing interviews and stuff. Even autobiographies are tricky because like the one Dilip was mentioning, Kanipayur's autobiography is something I've used in the work, but you have to constantly remind yourself that it's not a memoir. It's not about him. Like it is not a reflective piece where he is looking at how society is looking at him or how he's looking at society. It's very like it is presented as if it is some sort of objective. That is on the one hand. When you look at memoirs and autobiographies of political leaders in the 20th century, you have another problem where they call it a memoir and autobiography, but it is entirely about their public life. I think Balanandan's autobiography has 28 chapters. There is one chapter on his family. Everything else is about his public life. So what do we do with these is, again, for me, that was useful because I was looking at how are they using spaces and what are they not saying about the families. And, there's a chapter, I think it's in Balanandan's, where he's speaking about how his wife was so magnanimous and nice, and how because of his busy public life he didn't have time for his kids, and how his wife was didn't complain at all and like took all responsibilities as if it's some celebratory thing. And then she apparently stood for panchayat elections and won, and she was a panchayat member for a bit in the 1960s. And he says even when she was a panchayat member, she made sure that the family was well taken care of. And this is a memoir of a public figure, a politician who's like writing, entirely about. So I think even autobiographies are useful, but what we pick and choose from these can be quite tricky. So I would assume it'll have to be sort of oral histories, interviews, of that kind. And I hope the area that you're looking at and the period that you're looking at, you can still get a lot of useful.
Yeah. There are
Yeah. Dr. Hari, there are a couple of questions more in the chat.
Yeah.
The question from Saran Joseph.
Saran Joseph.
Yeah. Then there is a question from Swati.
Are there any regional spatial theoretical frameworks in relation to India and Kerala specifically, which can be used to analyze the specific spatial relations in Kerala compared to Western schools? I think I just answered that question when speaking with Vadivel. Thank you for your info. I'd like you to elaborate on the gender dynamics within the new public sphere emerged in Kerala during the 60s and 70s, like the Vayanashalas and the clubs. Yes, there is a peculiar absence in some sense, which is like, so this is the interesting that comes up is that in the 1930s and 40s, my reading is that what happens is there is a very vibrant sort of movement for all sorts of social reform, right? There is caste reform, there's religious reform, there is gender reform movements were very active and strong as well in the 1920s and 30s. But for some reason, what seems to have happened at the coming of the communist wave in the 1930s is also this idea that, you know, like my reading would be that gender somehow replaces caste as the natural alternative, in the sense that it becomes a very bifurcated public-private divide, where the private becomes a realm that is designated to like women to be in, and then there was this idea of a secular public male versus a conservative religious woman, which I think is something that we see. And I'm not saying like there weren't movements that exist in that period as well. Of course, women were very active members of the theater movement and other movements, and like the literature, like thing by the 1980s was picking up as well. But there's a peculiar absence from the very physical spaces like the Vayanashalas and clubs, at least in that period when I was speaking with. This begins to change with the 80s. Some of the interviews that I did with women who were in the Middle Ages now were speaking about how by the 80s they were being told off by their family. One told me that she was beaten by her brother because she was going to the Vayanashala to borrow books constantly while growing up in the 1980s and 90s, because the Vayanashala was seen as a place where good for nothing men would go and hang out. So like the family was very worried about the fact that she wanted to go. And then they eventually got to a compromise where the Vayanashala started delivering books to the house. So then they could order what books they wanted and then they would be delivered to the house. So she wouldn't actually have to go to the Vayanashala. There were all these sort of negotiations that were happening. But my favorite one about this sort of complexity of the public-private that I was mentioning earlier is also in the context of Vayanashalas from Devaki Nilamgod's memoir that she writes in the early 20th century, where she says that this is the 1920s where, you know, the brothers in the family were all going to the Vayanashala to like start to get educated about communism, to read all of these classics that were being translated. She says that she and her sisters, when they were menstruating and when they were locked into one room inside the house for the 3 or 4 days that they would menstruate, they weren't allowed to like obviously go out into the Vayanashala at any point, but there were also restrictions on what they could read. But she says when they were menstruating and they were locked in this room for 4 days, they would smuggle in translations of European classics that they would then be sitting and reading inside the rooms, because they knew nobody was going to come and like inspect them. Nobody was allowed to come and see them. Nobody was allowed to come and touch them. So they would sit there and read for the 3 or 4 days. But what is fascinating is that even there, the idea of pollution was so internalized for them that she says that they weren't allowed to touch the books because it would be considered impure. So they would have a helper who would sit there and turn the pages as they read the books. Right. And this is happening at a time when the brothers were going out to the Vayanashala, in the 1920s and 30s and learning about communism and this and that and everything. So there is a very conspicuous presence in this sense in physical forms that exist at the time, which I think is really interesting. Sorry, I have a question here from Asna, because I come from an architecture background. I was wondering about the aspect of design of space and how that impacts the spatiality of public interaction and notions of publicness in the work. Rise of mall spaces as a new public space, essentially the curated air-conditioned environments, materiality that contributes to the aesthetics and access of public space, and the people who are behind the commissioning of the spaces, and many more aspects like that. The short answer is no. I haven't looked at the design per se, especially at the modern spaces, because my book was mostly on the 20th century. I do end with sort of the 90s, and I make some comments on the contemporary spaces. But no, I haven't. But I have an interesting anecdote, which is from interviews, and I mentioned this in the book as well. So one of the things that I did when I was interviewing people is I let them decide where I would interview them. So I wouldn't suggest a place, partly because it was cities that I didn't know, or like villages that I didn't know any spaces in, but also because this was a thought experiment for me. And it gave me some really interesting insights based on the age, gender differences of people. So like, there was one specific example I remember of a man that I interviewed in Kochi. And I was sitting in a cafe somewhere in Kochi when he called me, and I said, "Oh, like I'm sitting in this cafe." So he came there to meet me. But the first thing he said when he met me was, "Oh, we won't sit here. And then he picked me up, and then we went on his bike and sat under a tree near the sea where he wanted to do the interview. And during the course of the interview, I would learn that, those trees were planted by him and his friends when they were growing up in the 60s and 70s, and they wanted to like create some space along the sea where youngsters could sit and interact and everything. There were other younger people who wanted to meet in shopping malls where you had to technically buy the public space. You had to buy a coffee to sit there and chat. It wasn't public in that sense. So that would be my only insight. Do you look at the emergence of commercial, private, and public, like vegetarian restaurants and family restaurants, for instance, the case of spatiality offered by public-private buses plying diverse individuals on a daily basis? Just curious. About the restaurants, not the contemporary ones. I do speak a little bit about the restaurants as they emerge, the coffee shops that emerged, the Nair and the Nambudri coffee shops that emerged in the early 20th century period. But it seems to be the case that very quickly the political economy of it was that they wouldn't have survived unless they catered to a larger, wider public, which is why they ended up opening it. I haven't looked at the contemporary spaces. As such, have you looked at the 5 Tinai system that has Agampuram binary? If I haven't, Tinai, look that up. I haven't. But we did some work, Dilip and I did something on Kolayas, which I think are similar to the Aintinais, no? Where you have the liminal space between the home and the public and how that interacts. Carmel says Julian Palasama. Oh, again, another name that I need to look up. Responsible for your rights about the Indian spaces of interaction. Chalapati talks. Yeah, the new kinds of vessels, the Davara systems. Yeah, I mentioned this. Venkatachalapati's work on in those days there was no coffee is a brilliant work that looks at sort of the use of spaces. I just want to respond to the current policy of Kerala government on creating public space and the promotion of night culture, like intervention of government into public sphere, like the Manaviyam Veedi is now renovated by the government and promoted. Manaviyam was actually one of the case studies that I look at a little bit in thinking about the contemporary spaces. I haven't looked at the government policies in it, but I do know, at least when I was doing this work, they were still trying to fend off political parties who wanted to come and put up a flagpole at the end of Manaviyam Veedi and like have their party flag in the corner near the Chai Kada towards the Altara Junction site. But I know that the government actually had also put aside some money to encourage similar corridors in other districts. I don't know how far that project, if anyone here knows, I'm happy to be enlightened. But I do think that there is some even the election manifesto that the LDF had in the last election had a substantive amount of discussion on the need for public grounds for people. They speak about it from the sense of how it is important for health for older people and for younger kids to come out and play. Even the ad that they had, the televised ad that they had, there was a prominent part of it where you see a public ground where people were coming out and sitting. So I think at least in the last election, there was some interest from the LDF government to try and encourage some of these spaces. The challenge, I think, would be to try and allow them to be autonomous. From a Lefebvrean sense, purely, if you look at the idea of autogestion, for them to be useful, they will have to remain like, the government might like encourage them, but then there has to be some level of hands-off approach where these spaces are allowed to do their thing without sort of too much political pressure on them to work one way or the other. But that would be my only comment on it. Have you looked at Aindinai? The question would be interesting to read Hari alongside Darshana's work on software, what she calls media publics, side as a creator of new spaces. Absolutely. Not just the work on software, she's also done something on Artigal Pongala, no? The idea of performance of religion in spaces in Kerala modernity, which I think is something that I've engaged with a bit more. But yeah, I don't know if any, I don't know, Christy or Dilip, if you have anything to add to any of those questions or comments.
Yeah. If any of you want to come and add to what Hari said, please do. Mr. Menon and Dr. Christie, please.
Now, I think the thing is that the two things that came up in the course of the discussion was one where people say, I am a geographer, I am a political scientist, I am this, and I'm not sure whether we need to think within those disciplinary boundaries. If we are indeed to think about the ways in which lives, imaginations, and identities are created and collide within Kerala, you need to be all of these, right? So to restrict oneself and say, oh, I won't include pictures because I'm a word person, and so on and so forth, it leads us nowhere. I think that's an important thing. The second thing I think is really that we need to think very centrally with the categories that we use now. Malayalis are like fascinated by the idea of modernity, right? And have we ever been modern, right? And this is why I brought up Ambedkar at the very beginning, because I think, when we say this, sociology, I'm a sociologist. In India, does a society exist? What should an Indian sociology be? That is the primary question, right? Rather than just imagining that there is such a discipline and that we can work with that. So I think these are the prior questions. And here is where we have to have the temerity, because very often it's easy to say nobody's done work on this, so I'm not referring to it. One has to do the work, right? In all of this, if we are to bring out anything new, you have to do the work. And I realize that there are different stages, and I think the book is brilliant in the economy with which it manages the argument. I mean, you were writing a PhD, right? I mean, it's not a life project of changing the intellectual universe. So when you're writing a PhD, there is a very specific, tight argument that you're making. And a lot of my comments had to do with how do we move beyond that, right? Because I think we are prisoners. When we do PhDs, we are imprisoned within disciplines, we are imprisoned within a literature, we're imprisoned, unfortunately, within the larger political economy that requires us to cite Lefebvre and so on and so forth, rather than Narayana Guru and Sangam literature when we are talking about space, because these are incomprehensible when we are doing our PhDs in the US or England or wherever we are doing it. And it's very difficult to summon up the changutam to do it there.
I was going to say, like, I think you need to come and talk to all of our universities to like convince them that it's okay to not fall in disciplines.
Well,
No, I want to speak about everything, this and that, and
life's too short
to do that. Yeah.
Dr. Christie.
I mean, I don't have any specific comments, but yeah, I hope you take this work forward, like to, to much more pertinent questions. And of course, this is a start, as Professor Dilip said, PhD, we do things that we need to like complete the degree. So we hope that you get a chance to like take up more questions on space, or I mean, however ways in which it helps us to understand sociality of Kerala or space of Kerala. So of course, not by compulsion of needing to adopt any theoretical background, but of course, like most of, if you look at, this is something that I always think of when reading literature from all kinds of places, that really, I mean, having a question in mind, which is connected to the ground, is extremely important. At the same time, I think something that has helped a lot of anti-caste scholars, including Ambedkar, is the exposure to the world of, knowledge from different parts of the world. But that doesn't mean that one needs to emulate that in one's scholarship. So I hope you get a chance to engage more with these questions since your major burden is over, which was your PhD and then first book. So
all I need is money now, funding.
Yeah. So wherever it comes from, I hope you get a chance to like engage with them and I mean, address more questions in relation to spatiality or space in Kerala.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a long and engaging session. I don't have anything to say and add, but I mean, I think this presupposition of an ideal social, is a problem that Kerala is facing for a long time, right? I think me and Devika are editing a book, and which basically looks at some of the emerging problems in the 21st century for the reality of Kerala development model and the socialities basically it represents. And frequently our authors were nudged by our editors and reviewers to use a comparative angle. We are far better than others. This sort of argument, comparing data with others, etc. Right? So, so that sort of a thing is invisibly present, in our thinking, which also basically allow us to grow our anxiety in the present context. Say that it was an ideal situation earlier. Now everything is collapsing, right? The kind of Hindutva politics that you're actually speaking about. We had Nilakal, agitation earlier.
Yeah.
We had a state-sponsored, communal move in Travancore in the 1930s. You remember what has been happening in Travancore under C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, right? So there was a revitalization of the Hindu community. There was an active presence of the Hindu Mahamandalam, the Hindu Mahasabha coming in, trying to engage in and negotiating with Nair Service Society. And perhaps what changed the scenario was the killing of Mahatma Gandhi, right? And also not only just perhaps others like Assamese, Bengalis, etc. What has happened when the migrants were actually brought back? The Malayali migrants were brought back from the Gulf, during the pandemic. What was the kind of response of the Kerala society, right? So I think it is important to think about the limits of those social spaces that we tend to think ideal. And also, as Professor Menon has rightly said, the counter forces, which were present throughout our modernity, right? This making of social spaces is very important. I think I have one more thing to say, because when you actually speak about, Dr. Christie has actually touched upon this binary of domination and resistance. Tend to believe that domination automatically, engenders a resistance from the same space, right? But perhaps our overarching anxiety today is, in the context of these authoritarian states, authoritarian parties, which is not, of course, limited to the party which is ruling the federal government, but also the state government, right? So increasingly, our capacity of resistance is shrinking, right? And it's important that we should keep the hope alive and the politics of hope alive. But it's also important to see, what are the kind of resistances possible now, right? You are actually speaking about these floating publics, right? And these floating publics are not actually getting translated into a stable, public. So these are the anxieties that perhaps, that current, expanding socialities at the same time facing in Kerala.
The contradictions, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for bringing all these pertinent issues to discussion. This is a time to thank Hari, Dr. Menon, Professor Menon, and Dr. Christie for your time and very enlightening, engaging discussion on this book. And we have the next iShore talking text series on the March 27th, which is on Ashok Nambiar's book on Malayalam novels in the 19th century. And Professor Uday Kumar and Dr. Rochelle Pinto are going to be the discussants. So we will be announcing the event soon in our social media platforms as well as on our website. Please do register and join us for the next event.
Will the PDF
Thank you
of the
all.
book be made available?
Pardon
Pardon
me?
If the PDF of the book is made available, we can read and come.
Yeah. Certainly, if it is available, we can make it available. Right. So thank you very much. And thank you all for participating in this long, engaging session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.